After Moses died, 7 shocking events that happened instantly. Imagine standing on the heights of Mount Nebo, watching Moses take his last breath, knowing that the greatest prophet of Israel, the one who spoke with God face to face, had just passed away. What happens next? The Bible records that the moment Moses died, a series of events unfolded instantly. Events so shocking, so miraculous, and so spiritually profound that they changed the course of Israelite history forever. These 7 occurrences were not random. Each one was orchestrated by God to teach lessons about His power, His justice, and His unwavering faithfulness to His people. When Moses died, it was not the end of God's plan. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Israel. Leadership was transferred, divine authority was confirmed, and God's presence was manifested in ways that inspired awe, obedience, and courage among the Israelites. The burial of Moses, shrouded in mystery and carried out by God Himself, emphasized humility, divine honor, and God's sovereignty. The immediate response of the people, guided by Joshua, demonstrated the importance of trust, faith, and obedience in the face of transition and uncertainty. In this video, we will explore these 7 shocking events in detail, uncovering the spiritual truths behind each occurrence. You will learn how God's actions at that critical moment provide timeless lessons for us today, teaching us about leadership, faith, vigilance, and reliance on His guidance. These events are not merely historical facts. They are a blueprint for understanding God's power, His plans, and the ways He shapes His people through both visible and hidden acts. By the end of this message, you will not only grasp the dramatic nature of what happened instantly after Moses' death, but you will also discover how these divine actions illuminate paths for obedience, courage, and unwavering faith. God's timing is perfect, His authority is absolute, and His lessons are eternal. Today, we are going to step into the moment after Moses died and witness the 7 shocking events that continue to inspire, challenge, and transform the lives of those who trust in Him. Part 1. Moses' death and the transfer of leadership. When Moses breathed his last on Mount Nebo, it was not merely the passing of a man. It was the end of an era for the people of Israel. Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt through the wilderness and had faithfully communicated God's instructions to them. His death marked a pivotal moment filled with both grief and anticipation, because God's plan for Israel was about to continue through new leadership. They had followed Moses for decades, witnessing his unique relationship with God, and now they faced the reality that their guide and mediator was no longer among them. God, however, had prepared for this moment with perfect wisdom and sovereignty. Joshua, who had been mentored by Moses for years, was ready to step into leadership. The transfer of authority was not gradual or uncertain. It was divinely orchestrated. The people had seen Joshua demonstrate courage, faith, and obedience, and now it was time for him to lead Israel into the Promised Land. This transition highlights a profound lesson for believers. God's plans are unbroken, even when human leaders depart. Leadership may change, circumstances may shift, but God's purposes continue with precision and assurance. The Israelites' reaction to Moses' death was immediate and telling. Fear, grief, and uncertainty mixed with reverence and anticipation. They had to confront the reality that the journey forward required trust, not in human strength, but in God's continued guidance. In that instant, the responsibility for obedience, courage, and faith shifted collectively onto the community, with Joshua serving as God's appointed leader. This moment teaches that faithfulness is not dependent on a single individual, but on God's enduring presence and guidance among his people. The divine orchestration of leadership transfer also reflects God's providence. Moses' mentorship of Joshua was intentional. Every lesson, every trial, and every instruction prepared Joshua for the moment he would assume command. God's plan unfolds through preparation, patience, and faithfulness. Believers today can see in this the importance of spiritual mentorship, guidance, and training. God equips those he calls, ensuring continuity and success in his purposes. This first event, the death of Moses and the seamless transfer of leadership to Joshua, serves as a template for understanding God's sovereignty in transition. Life will inevitably involve endings, losses, and shifts in leadership or circumstance. But God's hand remains active. He raises up those who are prepared, ensures the continuity of his plan, and provides reassurance that his people are never abandoned. The story calls us to trust in God's timing, honor his appointed leaders, and maintain faithfulness during moments of change and uncertainty. By observing this transition, believers today are reminded to cultivate spiritual readiness, support faithful leadership, and recognize that God's purposes transcend individual lifespans. Moses' death was not an end. It was the divine cue for the next phase of God's redemptive plan, teaching Israel and all believers that faithfulness, obedience, and trust in God are the true constants in every season of life. The burial of Moses and the mystery surrounding it. The moment after Moses died, God himself took responsibility for his burial. Scripture tells us that Moses was laid in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and that no one knows his grave to this day. This act, carried out directly by God, is both shocking and profoundly instructive. It demonstrates God's intimate care for his servants and underscores his sovereignty over life, death, and legacy. Unlike any other leader, Moses' burial was a divine mystery, hidden from human knowledge, signifying that God alone preserves and honors his faithful servants. The hidden burial of Moses carries deep theological significance. By concealing the grave, God ensured that Moses would not become an object of idolatry or undue veneration. The focus remained on God's power, presence, and promises, rather than on the man who had led Israel. This teaches believers the importance of humility, divine honor, and recognition that God's work through his servants is greater than the servants themselves. Faithfulness is to be acknowledged through obedience and life lived for God, not through monuments or human accolades. For the Israelites, the unseen burial was also a lesson in faith and reverence. They had witnessed Moses' extraordinary life, his intimate relationship with God, and his leadership through miracles, plagues, and guidance in the wilderness. Yet, at the moment of his death, they were reminded that the ultimate authority and honor belonged to God alone. The hidden grave reinforced dependence on God's guidance and the necessity of trusting his providence rather than focusing on human accomplishments. This event teaches modern believers about divine protection and the value of humility. God's concealment of Moses' grave ensured that even in death, Moses was safeguarded from misuse or misunderstanding. In the same way, God protects the legacies of the faithful, orchestrating outcomes in ways that humans may not fully understand. It reminds us that true honor comes from God, not from public recognition or human approval. The mysterious burial also points to God's sovereignty in the unseen. Life and death, blessing and legacy are ultimately in his hands. While humans may plan, name, or memorialize, God alone determines the lasting significance of a life lived in faithfulness. Moses' burial, hidden and divine, serves as a profound reminder that God's plans transcend human understanding, that He alone honors faithfulness perfectly, and that His power and authority govern all aspects of life and death. Finally, the burial highlights the continuity of God's plan. Even in Moses' death, God's purposes moved forward. The Israelites continued their journey under Joshua. The leadership transition occurred seamlessly, and God's promises remained steadfast. The hidden grave, like the unseen aspects of God's work in our own lives, assures believers that even when circumstances appear uncertain, God is sovereign, His plan is active, and His purposes will be fulfilled. This second event, the burial of Moses by God Himself, teaches humility, divine honor, protection, and trust in God's sovereignty. It reminds believers to honor God in life, rely on Him in death, and trust that He orchestrates His plans with perfect wisdom, often beyond human comprehension. By embracing this lesson, we learn to navigate life's uncertainties with faith, courage, and reverence for the God who governs all things. Part 3. Immediate display of God's power and presence. The moment Moses died, God's power and presence were unmistakably revealed to the Israelites. This was not a quiet or subtle transition. It was a divine demonstration designed to reassure the people, confirm leadership continuity, and remind them of His sovereignty. The sudden display of God's presence illustrated that the hand guiding Israel did not weaken with Moses' death, but remained ever active, orchestrating events and maintaining His promises. The Israelites had witnessed countless miracles under Moses' leadership: plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven, and water from the rock. Yet, even after these dramatic interventions, God's display at Moses' death was extraordinary. It was immediate, overwhelming, and awe-inspiring, leaving no doubt about His authority and care. This moment shows that God often uses critical junctures to communicate His power, instill confidence, and teach profound lessons about reliance on Him. The immediate manifestation of God's power served multiple purposes. First, it reassured the Israelites that His plan continued despite Moses' absence. Second, it validated Joshua's appointment as the new leader, confirming that God's authority and guidance extended through His chosen successors. Third, it provided a visible lesson to all future generations. God's presence is constant, even amid loss and transition. For believers today, this teaches the importance of trusting in God's timing, accepting His appointments, and recognizing His sovereign hand in leadership transitions. This display of divine power also reinforced obedience and reverence. The Israelites had often struggled with faith, murmuring and doubting despite repeated miracles. Witnessing God's unmistakable presence at Moses' death reminded them that His promises are reliable and His plans are perfect. It encouraged immediate trust and reinforced the necessity of aligning their actions with His will. Spiritual lessons like these are timeless. They teach believers that God's power is evident in moments of change, uncertainty, and challenge, requiring faith, attentiveness, and readiness to respond. Furthermore, God's presence illustrated that transitions in leadership are not merely human matters, but deeply spiritual events. The Israelites were called to follow Joshua not just because he was competent, but because God had appointed him and demonstrated His authority through tangible, awe-inspiring signs. For contemporary believers, this underscores that divine appointments, whether in leadership, service, or personal life carry God's authority, and recognizing His hand is essential for obedience, trust, and spiritual alignment. The immediacy of these displays also emphasizes the urgency with which God acts. Change, loss, or the end of an era is never a pause in His work. Rather, God continues to guide, protect, and fulfill His promises with precision and immediacy. The Israelites' experience demonstrates that believers should remain vigilant, responsive, and attentive to God's movements, especially during times of transition, uncertainty, or grief. Observing God's power ensures confidence, strengthens faith, and prepares the heart for the next steps in His plan. Finally, this event teaches that God's presence and power are constant assurances for believers. Just as He guided Israel after Moses' death, He guides each of His followers through seasons of loss, change, and uncertainty. The sudden manifestation of His authority provides not only reassurance, but also instruction. Trust Him fully, follow His appointed leaders, and rely on His sovereign control. This moment is a vivid reminder that God is intimately involved in His people's lives, orchestrating events for His glory, and ensuring that His purposes are accomplished with precision and authority. Part 4. The Israelites' Response and the Beginning of Conquest. After witnessing the dramatic events surrounding Moses' death and God's unmistakable display of power, the Israelites faced a pivotal moment, responding with faith, obedience, and readiness to move forward. This was the beginning of a new chapter, the conquest of the Promised Land. Their response provides crucial lessons for all believers about trust, courage, and the importance of following God's guidance in times of transition. The Israelites' reaction was a mixture of awe, fear, and anticipation. Having just experienced the loss of their longtime leader, they were confronted with the reality of new leadership under Joshua. At the same time, the miraculous confirmation of God's authority reinforced that the journey continued according to divine plan. Their response was not passive. They were called to immediate action, to cross the Jordan River, and to begin the work God had appointed. This demonstrates that faith requires movement, obedience, and courage, even when circumstances are uncertain or intimidating. Faith and obedience were critical as the Israelites prepared to enter the Promised Land. God's promise was clear, but the land was inhabited, fortified, and required strategic action. By responding promptly to God's instructions and following Joshua's leadership, the Israelites demonstrated that trust in God is inseparable from action. Believers today can learn that obedience often requires courage and decisiveness, especially when facing challenges, transitions, or new responsibilities in God's plan. The conquest also highlighted communal responsibility. Every member of Israel was called to participate, whether as warriors, supporters, or witnesses. The response was not only individual but collective, emphasizing that God's plans involve community engagement, shared commitment, and mutual encouragement. Modern believers can see in this example the importance of participating fully in God's work, supporting fellow believers, and remaining united in faith and action, particularly during spiritual or personal transition. Moreover, the beginning of the conquest illustrates the principle of immediate faith in action. God's power and promises were evident. Yet the Israelites were not spared from the work required to claim His promises. This teaches that divine blessing is accompanied by responsibility, diligence, and perseverance. Faith is validated through obedience and action, demonstrating trust in God's guidance while actively participating in His plan. Finally, the Israelites' response underscores hope courage, and the fulfillment of God's promises. By stepping forward into the promised land under Joshua's leadership, they exemplified the reward of faithfulness and the benefits of trusting in God's timing. For believers today, this serves as a powerful reminder that following God faithfully, even amid uncertainty or transition, leads to spiritual growth, fulfillment of His promises, and the assurance of His presence in every challenge. Part 5. Lessons and patterns for believers today. The 7 shocking events that unfolded instantly after Moses died are more than historical accounts. They are spiritual patterns and lessons for believers today. Each occurrence holds insight into God's character, His plan for His people, and the principles of faith, obedience, and vigilance that are timeless. Understanding these lessons equips us to navigate challenges, transitions, and spiritual responsibilities in our own lives with confidence and trust in God's sovereignty. First, the transfer of leadership to Joshua teaches the importance of spiritual mentorship and preparation. God carefully prepared Joshua over decades to assume authority. This reminds us that God equips those He calls, shaping hearts, knowledge, and character for the roles they will fulfill. Believers today can recognize the value of training, guidance, and mentorship in spiritual life, understanding that God's timing and preparation are perfect. Second, the hidden burial of Moses emphasizes humility and divine honor. God alone determined where Moses would be laid to rest, ensuring no idolatry or misuse of his legacy. For believers, this demonstrates that true honor comes from God, not human recognition. Faithful service, obedience, and devotion are what matter most, and God preserves and rewards His servants according to His perfect plan. Third, the immediate display of God's power and presence confirms that He works actively in critical moments. When circumstances change or leaders depart, God remains sovereign, guiding His people with unmistakable authority. Today, we are reminded that God is present in transitions, providing assurance and prompting action with clarity and power. We can trust Him even when life appears uncertain or daunting. Fourth, the Israelites' response to Moses' death highlights the necessity of faith in action. Witnessing God's power was not enough. They had to move forward, follow Joshua, and step into the challenges awaiting them. For modern believers, this is a call to obedience, courage, and trust in God's direction. Faith is validated through action, demonstrating reliance on God while actively engaging in His plan. Fifth, the immediate beginning of the conquest illustrates communal responsibility. God's work often requires collective effort, cooperation, and shared commitment. Each believer plays a role in advancing God's purposes, whether in personal growth, community support, or spreading His word. Participation, unity, and accountability strengthen the church's witness and ensure the fulfillment of God's plan. Sixth, these events emphasize divine timing and intentionality. Nothing occurred by accident. God orchestrated each moment to teach, guide, and refine His people. Believers today are encouraged to recognize God's timing in their lives, understanding that challenges, transitions, and blessings are all tools in His hands for spiritual growth, preparation, and alignment with His will. Patience and trust in God's schedule are essential. Seventh, enduring lessons of courage, faith, and hope emerge from these patterns. The Israelites faced uncertainty, leadership change, and the daunting task of entering the Promised Land. Yet, God's presence and guidance empowered them. For us, these events inspire confidence. reminding believers that God equips, protects, and directs those who trust Him fully, even in the face of fear, loss, or uncertainty. Finally, the 7 events demonstrate God's faithfulness and the fulfillment of His promises. Each occurrence was a step in His redemptive plan, providing assurance that His purposes cannot be thwarted. Believers are called to live in awareness of God's sovereignty, actively participate in His plan, and embrace trials, transitions, and opportunities as avenues for spiritual growth. These lessons teach vigilance, obedience, courage, and trust, ensuring that our faith remains steadfast, our hearts aligned with God, and our lives a testimony to His enduring power. In applying these lessons today, believers learn to honor God in leadership transitions, embrace humility, recognize divine power in every season, act in obedience, participate in communal responsibility, trust His timing, and cultivate hope and faith. Each event offers practical spiritual guidance, mentorship, faithfulness, readiness, courage, and active engagement in God's purposes. These patterns remain relevant, showing that God's Word and His historical actions continue to teach, shape, and inspire believers in every generation. By reflecting on the 7 events, believers can see how God orchestrates history with precision, power, and purpose. These patterns remind us that He calls us to live faithfully, act courageously, trust deeply, and follow His guidance through all seasons of life. The events after Moses' death are a divine roadmap for spiritual readiness, faithfulness, and obedience, providing timeless lessons that equip us to navigate life with unwavering confidence in God's sovereignty and promises. Conclusion: stand ready for God's plan. The 7 shocking events that followed Moses' death revealed timeless lessons about God's power, faithfulness, and the principles of obedience and trust. Moses' passing was not an end, but a transition, orchestrated by God to teach His people about leadership, humility, courage, and reliance on His guidance. Each event, leadership transfer, hidden burial, displays of divine presence, the Israelites' response, and the beginning of conquest, provide spiritual insight that remains relevant for believers today. We learn that God prepares those He calls, protects, and honors His faithful servants, and demonstrates His power in moments of change. The Israelites' obedience and courage serve as a model, teaching that faith requires action, communal engagement, and trust in divine timing. Trials, transitions, and challenges are not to be feared, but embraced as opportunities for spiritual growth and alignment with God's purposes. Ultimately, these events emphasize the sovereignty of God and the necessity of readiness, vigilance, and obedience. Believers are called to trust God's plan, embrace His guidance, and live faithfully, knowing that His promises are sure and His power is unchanging. By internalizing the lessons of these 7 events, we equip ourselves to navigate life's uncertainties with courage, hope, and unwavering faith, standing ready to participate in the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan and to experience the blessings He has prepared for those who follow Him faithfully. God's plan is perfect, His timing is precise, and His guidance is constant. Let us honor Him, trust His direction, and live in obedience, faith, and courage, ensuring that we are ready to witness and partake in the unfolding of His divine purposes, just as Israel was prepared to step into the promised land under His sovereign hand.